this almost feels like I'm in an auction selling something. And perhaps that's what I am, I'm selling the book. I'll need the PowerPoint. No, it's okay, I'll manage it. I can walk over there. That's absolutely fine, just in true auction style. I think the first thing I want to say is thanks to both Wits University and the University of Johannesburg for the support in bringing the book to life. But I think in particular, for academics, the book is quite an important celebration because it codifies and brings to life lots of effort, lots of hard work, and therefore it's a cause of celebration. And I think all the contributors, but the many people who are involved, deserve a celebratory tone of this evening. But in particular, I want to thank Shireen, because Shireen provided incisive intellectual leadership and very tough but fair management and empathetic management of the process. Had we been left to our own devices, we might not have got to this point. And so thanks to Shireen in particular for directing the project, but importantly directing the book as well. And we owe a lot to Shireen as well. I think we decided after much discussion that I shouldn't talk about the book. I should talk about something else and reflect the book in global debates, because in a sense, the whole idea is to sell you the book so that you'll read the book. So instead of me giving insights of the book, I'm going to talk about quality, access, and equity in the post-2015 education and development agenda. And this is work that's linked to the concerns of the book itself, because in a sense, when the idea of the CREATE project started, and when the idea of the book started, there's quite a strong argument that what was important in South Africa, and in fact what is important globally, is not just physical access. It's about access to what? And in that sense, the big debate globally and in South Africa is summarized by the one code word which synthesized much of the debate, which is about quality. And it's about what people get access to. And it's not just quality, it's about quality in relation to equity. Because a lot of the things I want to talk about today, it can be summarized, and in the book it's summarized as well, is that quality doesn't matter so much for those who come from wealthy and privileged backgrounds. Quality is a lot more important from those from poorer and more marginalized backgrounds, which is why when I talk about the global debate today, I'm going to talk about quality, access, and equity. And what I'm going to be talking about is the 2015 Education and Development Agenda. Because in a sense, into just some background before I talk. By the way, the longer version of the report and papers on the website, so I'm just going to try to synthesize quite a long, year-long work into a few slides. Hopefully it gives you a flavor of it. In 2000, as background, the UN General Assembly met, and they adopted the Millennium Declaration. This was preceded in April 2000, they met in September, by a meeting in Senegal where the Education for All goals were agreed. There were 6 Education for All goals. But what was interesting, as I'll show later, is that when the UN General Assembly met, they reduced the 6 goals to one single goal for education. There was a gender-related goal which links to education, but there was only one goal left for education. And that goal, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your standpoint, was about physical access to primary schools. And so the whole global community has, for the last almost 13, 14 years, been focused its attention on physical access to schooling as a result of an agreement made at the UN General Assembly. And in a sense, this time round, there's a longer period of process, as I'll show, about what should replace the Millennium Development Goals after 2015. So that when the UN General Assembly meets roughly around September 2015, what is the shape and form of the global development agenda and the global education agenda? Now what is interesting is that people have described the Millennium Development Goal process in the following words. They've described it as a northern tsunami and a southern ripple. Because I've been going around finding out whether it does matter in countries of the global south. And after a brief conversation with Verily just now, I'm beginning to realize that maybe it's also becoming a bit of a tsunami in South Africa as well. Because the agenda, one of the big debates that I'll show, is about how extensive the process is and how participatory the process is going to be in deciding what should replace the post-2015 agenda. So a bit about the process, if I can get that to work. Okay. The process I've been involved in is the consultations around what should be the education agenda. Now, the education discussions about the post-2015 agenda happens and is happening in parallel to 11 other discussions. Those range from water, health, to governance, and including the macroeconomic environment. And there are national dialogue, and these are figures that the UNICEF puts up, national dialogue in 88 countries. The nature of those dialogues one can discuss, one is not too sure about it. What is interesting about this consultation, and you should click on it, the website, it's called the My World Online Survey. If you click on that website, everybody who has access to the internet was asked to vote for which of the 6 priorities or 8 priorities they think are the most important for the post-2015 education. Development agenda, not education agenda. What is interesting about the voting to date is education has come up #1 priority. That without fail, education has been voted. They're closely followed by others like health, but education has been quite strongly endorsed as a key priority. This is despite some people's fears that it's likely that education might drop off the global agenda. Now, in addition to the consultation that UNICEF, UNESCO, who are the co-leads for education, there's also been the high-level panel of eminent persons. They've just published their report, and it's a new global partnership. And it's interesting in that document, they've also prioritized education, but I won't get into the textual analysis of the different documents. In addition, there's a third parallel process underway, which is called the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development. Because the one thing that's probably going to be most different about the post-2015 agenda is that at its core is most likely going to be a strong focus on sustainability issues and sustainable development. Because in fact, that OWG, as the acronym goes, is driven principally by the emerging BRICS countries in particular. And they're pushing very hard for an agenda related to sustainable development. And this is some figures drawn from the website. They claim that 1.2 million people have participated. Now, in global terms, the number is small. But if you compare it to the participation at around 2,000, you're talking of a much more extensive participatory process. But the question always remains is who actually is participating, whose voice is being heard the most. It's not just about which country is being heard the most, but which constituencies are being heard more loudly than other constituencies. Which are the organizations with the policy resources to make significant input? And one organization that is able to do that are organized advocacy groups and largely, interestingly, very large organized international NGOs. Save the Children, they can produce a policy paper on the post-2015. They did one within 2 months. So clearly they have the resources to do it. Now, as part of the process, the analysis that was undertaken was to look at the current MDG framework. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but just highlight a few. The one good thing about the current MDG framework, but it actually is that it galvanized support for poverty as priority. And in fact, up until 2000, poverty wasn't core to the development agenda. There was a lot more focus on growth, and perhaps growth might be coming in. But the other thing that I'm going to talk about, the other major advantage of the current MDGs And this is summarized by the South African Green Paper on performance. It goes, the strapline is, what gets measured gets done, right? In a sense, that's the advantage of any goal, right? However you disagree with goals and targets and indicators, if you measure something, it's likely to get people done. Unfortunately, it does beg the bigger question, which we put out in the report, which is whether what you're measuring is valued and meaningful. Because you can measure a lot of things, not all of it's valuable and meaningful. So the weaknesses of the current MDG framework, I think there's just two I want to highlight. The first one is that while it was welcome focus on poverty, it had a very poor attention on inequality. Because the big problem is not poverty, the big problem is really inequality. And there's been an absolute focus on the poor without focusing on the rich. Inequality conveys the relationality between the rich and the poor. The poor are not poor because they're poor because some people are rich. And I think the economic crisis, for those who follow you, tells you half the story. So in a sense, the big criticism was that the current MDGs have a limited unifying theory on the structural causes of poverty. And some would argue, and I think the CREATE project did a very good job, and the book, I would say this obviously, does a very good job of arguing that the MDGs, particularly on education, is very narrow in focus and reductionist in approach. Because by only focusing on access to schooling and physical access, it doesn't take into account what some would call meaningful learning or silent exclusion. There's about hundreds of words one can use to describe the same thing. And in a sense, that was the advantage and the conceptual move that the CREATE book makes, which is to argue that what is at stake here is what people learn. And in fact, those who read some of the econometric literature, what is coming out very clearly right now is that the early assumptions of the World Bank that years of schooling was important is actually wrong. That it's not how long people stay in school, it's what they learn in school. There's obviously a correlation between how long and what you learn, but fundamentally you can go through 12 years of schooling but not learn much. And for example, the current correlations show that levels of economic growth are correlated with quality, what you learn. But I won't get into those debates in a big way tonight. Okay. The one point on this slide I want to highlight, or two in fact. One of it is the current MDGs. The weakness is that it only focuses on measuring aggregate data. So comparing countries is fundamentally useful, but not very helpful. Because what it doesn't tell you is the differentiated attainment within countries, and that's a lot more important. For example, measuring the teacher-pupil ratio across a whole country doesn't tell you anything about the teacher-pupil ratio across school systems or school types. And in South Africa, the CREATE project showed that if you disaggregate, and current ENA results show you the same thing, if you disaggregate achievement data, there are parts of South African education system that are doing as well relative to international comparison, and others are doing worse. So having an aggregated measure of attainment for South African schools doesn't tell you about the deep-seated historic and structural inequities in South African schooling. And this was the thing that the global community is very good at doing, creating rival sets of goals between EFA and MDGs. And because you had these two global discourses around targets, they never sat very comfortably together. And that battle is going to go on for the next 2 years, because there's a fear from UNESCO's side that the EFA agenda will be driven at the expense of, so that the MDGs will be privileged, and the MDG people are afraid that UNESCO will drive an EFA agenda. But that's a debate that's going to go on for much time. What is interesting, I think, for me about the post-2015 education and development agenda is that it's a strong focus on equality and equity. And I think it's a distinction that's used in the CREATE book. The distinction is that It's not just about the sameness of treatment, but it's about the application of the principle of justifiable differentiation. So equity, to put it in another word, is fundamentally about redress at one level. There's a strong focus on sustainability, but critically, that the post-2015 agenda must be universally applicable, because the current MDG agenda is really written for developing countries. It says nothing about developed countries. It pretends like there's no inequities in developed countries, and it always uses the benchmark of developed countries to compare developing countries. And even those terms are contested. So there's a strong push that the focus of the new agenda must be globally applicable, and the conceptual tool that's going to be used is the word inequality. Inequality allows you to focus on differences between and within countries, whereas poverty wasn't as easy to do. And I think that's going to be the difference. You must just keep me on track on time. So I'm going to race ahead and say what are the headline agreements that are coming out. The first is the post-2015 Education and Development Agenda is going to be more than just access to primary. It's going to also talk about access at all levels and all forms. The debate is going to be here, which of these are going to be privileged in the post-2015. There's a strong claim for secondary, strong claim for post-secondary, that includes all levels, including tertiary, strong claim for ECC, and there's a strong claim for retaining adult literacy. And I'll show you later, as the technical act of developing the goals proceeds, some things are going to be dropped out along the way. And I think one of the victims might be post-secondary education, or at least tertiary, but it's not very clear yet. Certainly what's going to be retained is secondary, and I think certainly what's going to come very strongly is ECCE. Because in a sense, the argument is that inequalities don't begin when children enter school. Inequalities begin long before children enter schools. And those who work in education, and most of you do, would know that the differential attainment of a 7-year-old with or without ECC is a huge difference. So the attainment gap is already pronounced at the point of entry into primary schools. It's not something that only occurs once one enters primary schooling. But the biggest push, which echoes very much with the themes of the GREAT project and the book, is a focus on quality. And at the heart of the focus for quality is learning. A strong focus on learning, and a strong focus in recognized and measurable outcomes in mathematics and literacy, with a strong push from some people that it can't only be literacy and numeracy, it must also be those other factors of learning other than what we can measure, although that's hard to see and agree on. Teachers become very important in the post-2015 agenda. There's been organizations like Education International, for example, who've argued that if the post-2015 agenda is going to be fundamentally about quality, then it's fundamentally about teachers as well. That you can't talk about learning without talking about teachers and teaching. So fundamentally, the teachers and learning is going to be linked. In further work, and this became at some point in the process like a huge laundry list of everything everybody wanted, summarized by the word relevance. There was a strong push, and there still is a strong push, that education quality in the post-2015 agenda must be relevant. And relevance was understood as being responsive to changing global, regional, and national contexts, including preparing learners to become active citizens, equipping learners to lead informed and economically productive lives, raising awareness and appreciation of their rights. So quite a broad synthesis, which for some might not be specific enough, but it was trying to capture a strong swing that relevance is a little bit more. When it came down for it, here's what the aspects of relevance included, some of which gets dropped along the way, or will get dropped along the way. I should say that the discussions of the post-2015 education and development agenda are a bit of a moving target, because there's going to be many, many forums before there's clarity and agreement about it. Gender, inclusion, and education in emergencies remains or became three important cross-cutting themes in the consultations. Education in emergencies to capture both natural emergency context, but also conflict and post-conflict context. So how was all this translated? Well, that was the hard part. The translation of all of this was, in a sense, the one thing that one needs to understand from both a political and strategic view is there's only likely to be one education goal in any post-2015 development framework. And that is the trick. Which is the one goal you're going to try to get into the post-2015? Because remember, there are competing priorities, because the post-2015 development framework is not written for education, it's written for the whole field of development. So health wants a goal, growth, the people who are advocating growth wants a goal, etc. And it's also up for grabs at this point whether you're going to have the current 8-goal structure or whether you're going to have a thematic structure. Nonetheless, in education for now, the consensus is to anchor it around some kind of super goal, or what we call an overarching goal, which is about equitable quality education and lifelong learning for all. Now, at one level, if you were a linguist, that's a bit of a redundant sentence. You can't have equity and for all in the same sentence, because for all implies equity, right? But there's a political signification going on here. The argument that the education for all agenda missed equitable out of it. So despite its argument for all, there's a strong move that the word equity in some ways must be retained or be argued to be retained in any future goal. And hence the word equitable was put in front. Quality, because to suggest it's not just about access. Lifelong learning, whether that's still the perfect word, I'm not sure, but we can talk about that. But it's to try to capture it's a bit more than primary education. Now, that in a sense is where the current discussion is. There's going to be a lot more discussion between the current state until you hit 2015, right? Things are going to change rapidly along the way, and already they are. But the translation of that goal was forced. There was a discussion about what you would translate into. And here are 4 suggestions about it. Clearly, pre-primary education is in, right, of at least 1 year. The debate was whether it's 2 years, and this is a big debate to have. And so, if you like, the translation of the ECCE commitment was shifted to pre-primary at one level. What primary still remains because there's still an unfinished agenda, but you'll notice that in each of those sentences the word quality always turns up. And there's a way of embedding the word quality, which echoes very much what the work of Craig was suggesting, that quality is important. Craig was also suggesting that the big bottlenecks in South African education, but globally, are around secondary and lower secondary education, which is why there's a goal. The 4th one was about youth and adults, but youth in particular, because South Africa has 3 million people who are not in employment, education, or training, roughly. And there are also an equivalent number of young people, and the figures vary in South Africa, but on a global scale, the biggest dynamic that's going to shift in the next 5 years is what demographers call the transition has started occurring. The youth bulge, as it's called, is becoming much more felt throughout every part of the goal. Now, there's 2 causes the youth bulge goal, and I'm summarizing a big debate. Either you reach what the National Development Plan, or NPC in South Africa, call a sweet demographic transition in terms of young people and their profile, or you'll find an unbalanced demographic transition, and education is regarded as key to that transition process. But the key thing about the issue of youth was about talking of an education system not in narrow vocational sense, but about an education system that talks about relevance, skills, but also the big word is decent work. It's not just about employment, it's about what kind of employment. And here there's a big debate. The high-level panel report, by the way, only talks about employment, whereas the consultations of UNICEF and UNESCO uses the ILO definition of decent work as a way of arguing that this is about people getting opportunity to work, but not just any kind of work, because you can create very low-paid, unskilled, unsatisfactory work, or you can create other kinds of work. So there's a big debate to be had in the global agenda about this. So where is this going to go? What are the outstanding issues? The one outstanding issue is the convergence between the sectoral and thematic interests. What's occurred in the debate up to now is sectors like education, health, have been arguing for their own particular interest, and if you like, not seeing the interlinkages across sectors. The alternative paradigm, what people are calling an alternative paradigm for development, is to anchor it within a rights-based approach, but with thematic focus. So you don't have a sector education. You talk about inclusive and equitable economic growth, in which education, health has a part to play. Or you talk about another theme and you include the sectors within it. The question that's going to be deviled the post-2015 agenda is, how do you contextualize new frameworks to different country situations? Because if you think of the current MDGs like EFA, some of them from a statistical point are meaningless and impossible to achieve because they were framed for in a most aggregate way which can't apply. Like you're going to have you have a 50% target rate for adult literacy, right? And the current EFA. Well, what if a country already has 50%? That's not a meaningless target, a meaningful target. I think the third one is that as the ambitions for the post-2015 agenda grows, financing is going to become more important, and sustainable financing. How do you get forms of sustainable financing? Because in a sense you can agree whatever goals you like at the UN General Assembly, but the financing is largely going to be domestic or national. And how do countries finance an ambitious and comprehensive agenda? This last bullet point is an issue that's still very much up for grabs, is whether you can still advocate and should advocate for what some call a people-centered development agenda, as opposed to an international agency or a government-centric agenda. So where's things going to go? The first thing to resolve, even before you talk about the goal, is what is that post-2015 development framework going to look like? And by early to mid-2014, and it's looking more like mid-2014 than early 2014, there should be an agreement globally around the development framework, whether you're going to go for a thematic or a sectoral agenda, whether you're going to go for a sustainable development focused development agenda or not. Then the argument is that by September, and partly September because that's when the UN General Assembly meets, the draft framework should be in place, and so that by the time 2015 come around, learning from the experience of the past, you will have a concrete agenda and concrete framework, concrete goals, concrete targets put in place long before you hit the final consensus that you need to get to by about September 2015. So I guess in summary, it's a bit like there are lots of issues still outstanding, but I think there are certain trends that are emerging. Quite a few which are echoed in the book itself, and one of the big trends is a strong focus on quality and equity. To say access on its own without physical access to schooling, without a strong focus on quality and equity is almost meaningless. And I think that was the biggest lesson, I guess, for everybody who in one way or another were associated with the CREATE project. that by dividing physical access from quality and equity, you were only getting a partial picture of life in education. And that's why I think the South African work on CREATE was different from other countries. It put forward to the other countries a strong focus on quality and learning and equity as well. So that was the one thing. I think the second thing is there's a strong possibility of an alternative paradigm of development going, a global paradigm of development. But it's not uncontested. There's a strong growth agenda as well. There are people who are very strongly arguing for a development paradigm which focuses on growth. And that growth then becomes the driver of everything else. Others are arguing for alternative paradigms. So in a sense, what is also up for grabs and for contestation and argument is what is the kind of development paradigm you're looking at. The third big thing I think educationists haven't paid enough attention to, I guess, is at one level issues of sustainable development. It's always been seen and still is seen in a very narrow way about learning about the environment. Those are important issues, but sustainable development is a bigger concept, and somehow the education community needs to engage with that. The fourth important thing is that learning is going to be at the heart of the post-2015 agenda. The question is, what is that learning going to look like, and how will you measure learning? And in fact, the joke that I often make is that if learning remains and will remain as part of the post-2015 agenda, the only people who really benefit, unless you get a proper handling, are the testing people, right? The AGRA people and all the others. So in a sense, I think Anil told me this joke about the no child left behind policy. It was renamed as the no tester left behind policy. Because in a sense, there's a mania about testing. And I can already see that from the daily influx of emails and other things. Everybody's producing a test to be used for the developing world. There's the Learning Matrix Task Force, for example, which has just released its first of its many reports on what learning would look like, talking about 7 domains of learning, etc. The last thing to say about the post-2015 agenda in terms of the issues and linking it directly to the issues. Issues of education and the development and the post-2015 global education development are highly contested and highly political. And in a sense, the contestation is as important as the final goal. And in a sense, one has to have good arguments, good evidence, and good informed opinions and positions to engage with the debate. So hopefully I haven't spoken too long, but thank you.
I think some people have prepared some words, so should I let that happen? And then maybe a few questions to, if you've got any questions to Yusuf, that's the other way to arrange this. My words. Finding Place and Keeping Pace is a somewhat depressing book. It's true that when we were doing the field work, we were looking for areas where that were most likely to have school dropouts. So not the best places to find the happy stories. But if you are looking for something uplifting, it was usually followed by some despair. So maybe the good news is that we have a very high enrollment rate. But it's just as likely that that's really the crux of the bad news. In some senses, I was often heard muttering that all the shouts about one goal during the World Cup were just turning me into a cynical de-schooler. And I think that one thing that we did recognize was the power of education. If we were able to say how terribly depressing the picture could be, we were also in a sense acknowledging how powerful education was in how powerful it could be in turning things around. So when I search for an uplifting story in the book, I have to remember walking into the classroom of a grade 7 teacher in one of the schools in an informal settlement, and the wind sort of gently tossing the paper hexagons and pyramids and paper cubes sort of strung up on the ceiling of her class. And in that school, when we tested the kids, the grade 4 class performed significantly below the average. But her class, the grade 7 class, suddenly performed significantly above the average. And I think that teacher turned the tide for me in some senses. Sure, if we think, how did she do it? Well, I have to look back and acknowledge that she maybe had smaller classes. She had better resources. It was a relatively new school in a sense. And of course there was that teacher's own incredible creativity, her immense sense of calm, and the excitement in her class. Questions were asked and there was just 1,000 hands shooting up to answer the questions. And then there was her own self-reflective criticism. She kept saying to me, she's recognized that she hadn't done enough repetition. She was chasing through the curriculum to try do things to get through the curriculum, and that what her learners really needed was to be drummed in the lessons again and again, to go back over, to do the repetition, to do some of the drills and the and to get the lessons drummed in. And that's what the middle classes, in a sense, were getting back at home, and her students simply didn't have that extra support. So, you know, that teacher, that single gem, she taught me a lot. She punctured my cynicism, and she taught me that even when the foundations aren't there, even when children arrive in her class without the basics, that there was a chance for there to be time for them to catch up. So learning wasn't always an uphill curve. It was a series of stops and starts, of struggle. And that there is no magic bullet, it's the steady grind that makes the difference.
When I reflect on the book, and I think back of the parents we interviewed, the confusions that they had. They failed to participate in their own children's education due to certain constraints that they were going through. They did not even understand how much they should be involved, let alone disciplining their own children. They complained a lot about the rights that have been given to children. They don't know what to do. At times, they find themselves trying to find food to put on the table. They were so immersed on thinking about what must I give my child, rather than how can I help my child go through a schoolwork, or helping the child with homework. Most of the parents that we came across were single parents, were women. And because of this migration of their husbands to find work somewhere in the cities, sometimes they themselves, they migrate with their children or leaving their children with grandmothers behind, disrupting the whole process of primary schooling for the child. These are the realities that we came across, which are reflected in the book as well.
The work that I did in the Create book, and thank you to Shireen for inviting me, was related to primary maths, which is the area that I work in. The chapter that is in there is focused on some of the schools that Viola talked about in the Eastern Cape, poor schools, poor rural schools. And we did a little study which was focused on the idea of opportunity to learn, which is a widely written about concept in the education literature. The way we did it was to get a sample of workbooks from 3 of the schools that were in the Eastern Cape sample. We looked at a sample of workbooks that the teachers told us were across the attainment range, so we had weaker children all the way up to stronger children. And we got workbooks from grades 2, grade 4 and 6 because we wanted to understand a little bit about progression. The findings in some ways was the depressing story that Viola has alluded to. One of the things that we looked at was what learning outcomes were covered, and it was at the time of the RNCS, the previous curriculum incarnation. We also looked at the nature and the number of questions that were asked within lessons and across lessons, because we got workbooks, the learner workbooks for the entire year. And that allowed us to comment a little bit on differentiation and progression in these 3 primary schools. The findings mirrored a little bit what we've heard actually in broader literature in the South African landscape. We saw a very low pace of coverage across the grades in the books that we saw. So quite commonly, we ended up with 8 different classes across the 3 grades in the 3 schools because one grade didn't send us the workbooks. In 6 of those 8 classes, when we looked at the learner workbooks across the whole year, there were less than 30 tasks for a whole year's work, less than 30 lessons in a whole year's work. And it's a finding that's been written about in other places as well. We also found when we looked within lessons, it was very, very common to find 3 sums that were written in a learner workbook, 3 addition sums, 3 subtraction sums, which constituted a lesson's work, which just compounds the problem of coverage. We also found that the picture was generally slightly better in grade 2 in terms of coverage aligned to the curriculum than it was in the higher grades. And that is interesting in the context which is now post the CREATE data collection, which is the anno context, where we're tending to see higher performance in grade 2 with performance falling off in the later primary grades. We also found at the level of content, most of the work that was done, and there wasn't very much work that was done, most of the work was on number. Almost a complete ignoring of algebra and pattern work and limited focus on the other mathematical areas as well. Another interesting finding, because we had the learner workbooks which teachers had marked, was quite often the marking was incorrect. So children had done things wrong, but the marking showed ticks in the learner workbooks. And we talk a little bit in the chapter about what some of those errors are. I think the broader situation for me is to mirror much of what Viola has said. It is a largely depressing story, but I think as education researchers and people working in the field, our job is not to feel depressed by the data. It's actually to then think about what the implications are for the work that we do with teachers in particular, and Yusuf alluded to the fact that teacher knowledge, teacher development is one of the aspects that's being foregrounded in the post-2015 agenda, and certainly it's an agenda that if I had to pick, I would certainly be supporting. I think my last point is, again, reflecting back on what Yusuf presented, is much of the work in those development goals is about finding good proxies for learning. So one of the proxies that you mentioned was the idea that access for all became a proxy for equity, and we found that access for all didn't deliver what we wanted in terms of the equity agenda. There are similar things going on within the field of education, and in mathematics education in particular. The proxy that's mentioned in that chapter and in the broader literature is coverage equals learning. And that is interesting because in the post-CAPS curriculum context, coverage is being almost factored into the design of curriculum. I think what will be interesting for us to look for in a few years' time is whether that was an appropriate proxy. Because just as Yusuf said, we can have children getting through to grade 11 and 12, they might not have done very much learning. I think we run the risk in the current context of having coverage of the curriculum, i.e. teachers doing their work at the level of delivery, but we might still not find that learning is where it is because teaching can outpace learning with a very prescriptive context. So I think we've got interesting times up ahead leading out of some of the work that was done. Thanks.
We wrote a little chapter on the parental involvement. What you notice in the policy of South Africa of parental participation is that the policy seems to espouse that parents should participate only as governors of the school. In other words, they only come when there's a meeting in a school, and only look at the administrative side of things in the school. But somewhere in between, there's an expectation that their participation in the school is going to make some difference in actually enabling the school to, the learners, because the strategic business of the school is about teaching and learning. So the attempt that we really wanted to make in the chapter is a conceptual distinction between the parental involvement and parental participation. And participation definition being that of just being present in the school, and involvement actually being involved in every little thing that is happening, especially with the children learning. So you find in our schools that one principal will be happy that when he has the presence, that whenever he has his meetings, the meetings are packed and the parents are always there. So, but when you go to parents and you actually ask them, what is it that you actually do when you go to those meetings in school? What you find that the parents are mainly there to, most of the cases, to endorse the things that the principal wants to have, instead of being the partners together with the school to be partnering in the project of education. So it was an interesting insight that even the policy, at the policy level, there is no conceptual clarity about what is it exactly that parents do in our schools. In as far as teaching and learning is, because the policy seems to be relegating them to task of fencing, painting the school and stuff like that. But the primary role of being clients to the school is about their children learning in the school in the first place. So that was one insight that we find in the school, and it is other things really that depressing. But it was interesting to find that at least there is willingness, but we also find that our parents are incapacitated to actually participate in a meaningful way, because CREATE is looking at ways by which the participation or involvement is such that there is actually meaningful activity happening. So we did not find that link that actually meaningful. It remains at this stage an ideal that the involvement of parents has not yet reached the ideal of actually meaningful realizing what the school is about in the first place. That is one thing that was a big highlight, and that's what we're trying to highlight in that chapter. The big thing is that there needs to be conceptual clarity, at least at the level of the policy, of what would parents be doing in the school in order to help their children learn. Thank you.
The chapter that Bev and I wrote was from a study undertaken, a national household survey undertaken by Social Surveys, where Bev is the director, with the Centre for Applied Legal Studies. The focus of the survey began with trying to provide an independent estimate of the number of children who are out of school, and then trying to understand why they left. We included a range of other questions around age, extent of repetition, etc. And when starting to analyze the data, what really came out for us as the most interesting stuff was not the stuff that the survey had intended to assess. So, and the CREATE book and the framing, and particularly Conversations with Vala, provided a really valuable frame, I think, for understanding what we were seeing in the data. So what that was really looking at the extent of overage learners in the system, the reasons for that, primarily repetition, but how that and how that sort of unique in the South African case of this incredibly high levels of enrollment up until ages of 15, 16, 17 up was masking what was really happening. So in other words, the fact that we had this incredibly high enrollment rate was masked by age, was masking the fact that so many children were dropping out of school in grades 10 and 11. So that in actual fact you only had, the estimates vary between 40 to 50% of people entering the school system actually exit. So for us, and then thinking about what caused that, and the CREATE frame around thinking through meaningful access to education provided a really useful conceptual framing for understanding what we were finding, which is that it was the quality of education that was really impacting on school dropout. and we think even more so than poverty, despite the fact that poverty plays a role. So it does raise interesting questions in relation to your presentation about what kinds of proxies you use for measuring that. And that it seems to me that perhaps whilst introducing multiple levels of, or many goals, introduces a certain kind of complexity, one can see oneself getting lost in that, they're not as strong. It's maybe where one should err on, because gross enrollment rates on their own actually turn out to tell us very little about the South African school system.
Just to add on to what Sarah was saying, when we undertook the study, I think we were looking more at systemic issues and racial and gender differences and issues with children being blocked from access to schools. But I think very early on in our exploratory work, we also found that, albeit that the systemic issues were huge, that in fact poverty and the contextual factors in our country played an enormous role. And all of a sudden everything wasn't so clear cut, it wasn't all just about the system, but it was about trying to understand the context and how those contextual factors of poverty played such an important role on the learning of children. Down to things like when a family ran out of money at the end of the month and didn't have candles, where children in a shack never had space to actually be able to learn, where you were still concentrating on issues of survival, and therefore, gathering of wood and water and all of those things meant that you often couldn't concentrate on your books. And I think Yusuf basically touched on this earlier in his talk as well, that we can't forget the context, and we can't forget how different countries are different, and we need to look at our education system within a larger perspective. Thank you.